Our first panel covers respecting the ability, ensuring authentic representation in the entertainment industry. With 1 in 5 people having a disability in the US today, the lack of representation, just 3.1% on screen, and even less in children's television, means that millions of people don't see themselves reflected in media. RespectAbility has been honored to play a part in changing this, including consulting on an array of films and TV shows for a variety of studios and networks. But change must be embraced from the top and have buy-in at every level. How are network and studio executives, showrunners, and writers and actors working to encourage more disability representation, whether in front or behind the camera? What are promising practices in diversity and inclusion, and how are they helping to move things in a positive direction? To address these questions and more, I am so thrilled to have this panel joining me today because they are really leaders in making this happen. The first, Carolyn Lertzman, Manager, Standards and Practices, Disney Channels. Carolyn works at the intersection of content review with Disney Channel Standards and Practices, diversity and inclusion, and Walt Disney Television corporate social responsibility to champion inclusive content that reflects the lived experience of Disney's kids and family audiences. Carolyn joined Disney in 2008, following graduate school at UCLA School of Public Health, specializing in health communications and children's health and media. Also joining us is Jennifer Turner. She is the Senior Vice President of Television Scripted Programming at Sony Pictures Entertainment and the current executive for such shows as The Good Doctor and The Blacklist. Over the years, she has worked in daytime and primetime programming at ABC, overseeing such shows as General Hospital and Desperate Housewives, Lost, and Grey's Anatomy. While at Universal Media Studios, she managed creative for the critically acclaimed series Friday Night Lights and Crossing Jordan. Jennifer holds a doctorate in public health. Our third panelist is Grace Moss. As NBC Entertainment's head of talent development and inclusion, Grace directs entertainment diversity initiatives at NBC. She oversees multiple programs that focus on discovering, cultivating, and showcasing talented writers and directors of diverse backgrounds with the purpose of getting them staffed at NBC's primetime slate. Grace also manages outreach efforts to community partners to bring their expertise and knowledge to the network. Previously, Grace worked in development and production at the Style Network and at MTV. Our fourth panelist is David Renaud, producer on ABC's The Good Doctor. At 19, David was paralyzed in a car accident, which ultimately led to an interest in medicine and a career as a doctor. Then, as a writer who can authentically tell stories about medicine. He is a graduate of the Disney ABC Writers Program. Besides The Good Doctor, David has written episodes for the series Pure Genius and Blood and Oil. And something to look forward to, he is the creator and executive producer of a new series inspired by his life in development at ABC. Our next panelist is Shashana Stern. She is a creator, writer, and actress. She is best known for her roles on Weeds, Supernatural, and Jericho. Shoshannah created, wrote, and starred in This Close on Sundance Channel with Josh Feldman, who is also deaf, which makes This Close the first television series created, written, and starring deaf or disabled people. Our final panelist is Elisabeth Finch. She is a writer whose credits include True Blood, Vampire Diaries, and No Ordinary Family. She is a longtime co-executive producer and writer on Grey's Anatomy, whose own chronic illness, cancer, inspired her to write several episodes of Grey's Anatomy that challenges how we treat and think about cancer as a chronic illness that can also be managed. Thank God, all that is over. We're going to start our discussion with David, Elisabeth, and Shoshannah. All three of you are proof that the industry is starting to recognize the importance of having professionals behind the camera who bring the perspective of someone with a disability and to make sure that storytelling is authentic. Elisabeth, how has the fact that you are a writer who has a disability impacted the Grey's Anatomy writing room? Can you give us an example of that impact?
Yeah, well, I think anytime you have somebody who is representing a community and that looks like the world around us on television, people get to see themselves. We get to see different parts of ourselves. There's nuance, there's specificity. I wrote a couple episodes about a character who is going through cancer and ends up living with cancer because that's my specific lived experience. And it was born of a conversation from the writer's room where people were talking about treatment in terms of bravery and losing and winning and battles and fights. And in my experience, I don't know who wins and I don't know who loses. There were 13 people in my clinical trial. I am the last one who's alive. Who is alive? Am I the winner? Are they losers for dying? And these are conversations that don't often get spoken about when we talk about cancer. So having the fact that I was in the room to bring that up and to have that discussion, our showrunner was able to say, we should be talking about this. We should be talking about what your life looks like. Because they had seen me for years, lived with cancer and be in the writer's room and carry on a full life.
That's amazing. And did you hear from viewers who suddenly felt like there was a story that they could relate to or that somehow related to their life, their experience with a chronic illness?
Yeah, there were a lot of people who reached out on that level who were living that experience and said, thank you, now this mirrors my experience. There are also people who were on the crew and in the writer's room that saw specific scenes where someone found out that they were going to have to live with cancer rather than the binary state of diagnosed or dead, or cured or dead. So, and they even came up to me saying, like, I didn't understand how finding out that you still have cancer left in you could be good news, could be something to celebrate. So I think a lot of people had a perspective that they didn't have before because we've been showing it far too much in a black and white state.
A great example of how someone, with a disability and who's willing to share that and with the others in the writing room can really make a difference to what we're seeing on television. David, have you had a similar experience? Can you give an example of where your unique knowledge impacted the direction of a story?
Yeah, I'm probably just going to echo a little bit of what Elisabeth just said, but I think, our job as writers, particularly in the writer's room, is to bring our personal experiences into our storytelling. I mean, that's why our showrunners hire us, because they want varied experiences to tell varied stories. And, when my experiences as a person with a disability, so I naturally am going to tend to bring stories like that into the writer's room. And a lot of times, our lead character in The Good Doctor is someone who has ASDs on the spectrum, has ASD. And that, to me, I've always connected with that. As someone who's been a doctor going through residency with a disability, trying to navigate the world of medicine and the expectations of your doctor being perfect and being able to cure everything, and I always related to that in Dr. Sean Murphy's journey on our show. So I think almost everything I pitch in some way is influenced by that. I also, if you look at my body of scripts, you'll see a pattern. There's almost always either a character with a disability in my episodes, or there's issues that are really intimately linked to the sort of struggles of feeling like an outsider, feeling underestimated, and trying to prove that you belong. And that's, so I think that bleeds into every story. And I definitely, get some outsized influence on The Good Doctor because I'm a medical doctor too. So that finds its way into some of the cases as well, in everybody's episodes, I think, a little bit.
That's great. Shoshannah, while David and Elisabeth acquired their disabilities as adults, you were born with yours. Did you have role models in television that inspired you to pursue a career in television, first as an actress and then as a writer-producer?
Yes, and also no. I talk about this a lot because it's something that recently happened during a premiere. Like, I think oftentimes when I was at home, looking through a lot of my old stories that I wrote as a child, I realized that all of the stories were written about hearing children. And I think that's because I never saw a deaf child like myself on television or in film while I was growing up. And so I intentionally erased myself from my own stories. And I remember seeing Marlee Matlin as a young woman winning the Academy Award, and I was like, wow, I want to do that. But it never really occurred to me to actually write my own story because there were no deaf writers, no deaf producers at the time. So I think it took me a long time to realize that I can actually write my own story, write a story for myself. I don't have to wait for somebody else to write that story for me. So I started writing like in my 20s.
And did This Close, your series on the Sundance Channel, why specifically that story? How did you feel that you could perhaps tell a story that other people couldn't tell?
Again, yes and no. I think when we first pitched the idea, it was two best friends. One was going to be a deaf woman and one was a hearing gay man. And I thought I was just conditioned to always see a deaf person with a hearing, a hearing foil. That was like the magical equation. Like there needed to be a way for a deaf person to explain their experience through another. And so this other becomes the door by which the audience is able to understand the deaf character. But that didn't work out. So then we just decided, hey, let's just go ahead and tell, in our pilot, let's just post our pilot on YouTube and tell the story as we believe it to be, and have that story be about two deaf characters. And when that happened, the deafness became the invisible piece of the story.
Yeah, it's a wonderful.
Deaf people are not actually deaf until they actually meet or encounter hearing people.
Interesting. Well, let's take a little look at This Close. We have a clip. What I love about your show is it's not clearly deaf people swear like the rest of us, and they have lots of problems like the rest of us, and they can be selfish like the rest of us. I just think it's just so unfiltered and wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much for saying so. I've always, my struggle as an actor before I started writing for myself was a lot of people would think that being deaf as a was the character. Like being deaf is but being deaf in and of itself is a character, and that is in and of itself a storyline. But that it actually can be a layer on top of a character that is already complicated, has their own story to live. It's not the central feature of the story. It's not the central feature of the character's life. And so that has very little to do with our show. I think, and that's true for all people from minority communities.
Well said. As I said earlier, the industry has started to make us serious efforts to bring more lived experiences into the creation of television shows, whether it's racial, sexual identity, or disability. David, you were in the Disney ABC Writers Program. I'm guessing you were one of the first people with a disability in the Writers Program. Did it set you up for success?
I mean, those programs definitely do that for everybody. I'm not sure if I was the first, but I definitely was one of the first people through the program. There have been several since I've been through the program. Yeah, it gives you an opportunity to access writers' rooms. And as someone with a disability, particularly a physical disability, it's really hard to get into writers' rooms. It's hard to get those entry-level jobs. There's a lot of expectation with those entry-level jobs in the writer's room, like PA jobs and writer's assistant jobs, that you're going to be running around and getting coffee and getting people lunch. And there's the assumption, I think, made, a lot of assumptions are always made about people with disabilities, that you can't do that. So the program sort of opens up doors by giving you access in a way that you wouldn't be able to get without the program. And they're also very incredibly supportive and encouraging, when you leave the program, I found. That's
great. Now I'd like to bring in our 3 studio executives who can help us advance this conversation. As I mentioned, we have Carolyn Lertzman from Disney, Grace Moss from NBC, and Jennifer Turner from Sony. Carolyn, Disney has been a leader pushing for more diversity in front and behind the camera. What's the biggest challenge you've faced in making this happen?
I think the biggest challenge is that just knowing the fact that 25% of disabilities are visible and 75% are invisible, that there's just, and thinking too how many people in general are comfortable self-identifying for that 75% that are invisible. I think the stigma around talking about disability is probably the biggest challenge. And that what I've seen is that the more disability shows up in content, the more we have great talent like David, the more we have great shows where I can list several from Disney channels and several across, the more times we see someone like Lauren Ridloff be cast in major roles, it's like one thing begets another. And all of a sudden, we have these, we're constantly sharing with our team what's going on in this space. And after every time I share with those teams, I hear from colleagues and they're, oh, well, I don't have a disability, but someone in my family does. Or I know it's like, it really affects everyone. And so I think that the biggest challenge is just being able to talk about it.
Disney obviously is known for doing a lot of children's and family programming. You recently introduced a character to Ducktales with a disability. The character is Della Duck, Donald's sister, and the mother of Huey, Dewey, and Louie. I want to hear what went into this, but first, let's watch a clip from Ducktales, which can be seen on the Disney Channel and Disney Now. Let's take a look at the clip.
It's you! It's really you! Oh, I can't believe it! Oh, look at you! Oh, standing here! Oh, I thought you were
dead? Not yet.
Where?
The moon.
You were on the moon? I searched the moon.
Not hard enough. There were mites and aliens, and I had to rebuild the spear with my tooth.
Don't raise your voice at me, you rapacious rocketeer.
I missed your Scroogean alliteration. Lost it in the crash.
Out of rocket parts! Brilliant! Let her know you're every bit the woman you were 10 years ago.
Out of my way, old man. Where are my...
Who's the cyborg?
Is that? It can't be.
Guys, I think that's your mom.
Huey, Dewey, Louie, meet Della Duck.
Oh, I'm part robot. I knew it.
Oh my God, it's so reverent, but at the same time, it's so emotional. Carolyn, tell us what goes into introducing the character of Della Duck. I'm sure a lot of thought goes into it.
Oh yeah, I still remember the call that the writers had with the Amputee Coalition, who consulted on this character like it was yesterday, and it was supposed to be a 30-minute call, and it lasted almost 2 hours. And they wanted to make sure, the writers, they knew they were going to introduce Della Duck. She had previously only appeared in the comic books, and they wanted to make sure that it was important to them that she was a character from an underrepresented community, and they felt like representing a character from part of the limb loss community was something that they have not seen a lot of on in kids television. And so they asked for questions on, specifically on her prosthetic. They also had to figure out, how is Della she doesn't only walk in the show on Earth, how is she going to walk on the moon? What are the mechanics going to be in her gait with the prosthetic? And also making sure that the storyline, the writers asked lots of questions because it was very important to them that her disability is not something, that's not the only thing that her character is about. It was very important for the team from the start to make sure that she's multidimensional. And you can see from that clip, yes, that's one part of her using a prosthetic is one part of who she is, but she is so much more than that. And the most amazing thing too is that she's not just in one episode. It's not just a special episode introducing her and talking about what happened to her. She's a recurring character. They're in season, she continues to be part of the main cast now, which I think is the ultimate way of inclusion, where that, we have these characters and it's not just a one-time thing. It's something, because people living with disabilities, they don't just appear one day. Like everyone's living their lives, and that's one of the best things that we can do, is to show that.
Yeah, that was really wonderful. Jennifer, you're the current executive at Sony for The Good Doctor and other shows. Do you work with showrunners to help them find writers that bring lived experiences, including disability, into their writers' staffs?
Yes, absolutely. So, we want to tell rich, compelling, emotionally resonant, and authentic stories. And I think one of the things that you're hearing about as a theme of this panel is that writers write about what they know. They write about their experience. And it's from that experience that you have that true authenticity and the specificity that you need to really explore a character, to really explore a subject, and ultimately produce a better narrative. And so, yes, we work very closely with our showrunners to make sure that we are having an inclusive and diverse staff as possible, so that we can, again, have better stories that are truthful and have that emotional connection.
That's great. Grace, what's NBC's approach to encouraging more diversity, including disability representation in front and behind the camera? Certainly the NBC drama New Amsterdam has been a shining star for disability representation. Are there efforts at NBC to connect with actors with disability?
Yeah, absolutely. As far as our approach, we really try to make it as holistic as possible. So, of course, like Jennifer, we work very closely with our showrunners to help them staff their rooms with underrepresented writers from all communities. Specifically, we have our Writers on the Verge program, which is a great pipeline program for writers who come from these underrepresented groups to get access to our executives. In this current class, we actually have 2 writers with neurodisabilities who are, at the top of our list to get staffed. One of them actually did get staffed at Netflix, and we're working on the other one to get in the mix as well. So definitely with the staffing component. We also work with the WGA to get in touch with their writers with disabilities and see who we can also tap into. We take general meetings with writers all the time, and then based on the needs of the network, we curate staffing lists to the different shows. And then on the other side of that, we also work to educate our creative executives and our showrunners on the sort of nuances of the different communities. So as an example, we did a media training that was led by RespectAbility, not just with our creative executives, but with our showrunners, to talk about how they, this community should be portrayed in television. What are some of the blind spots? What are some of the best practices? And we also work with RespectAbility to consult on our shows when possible. And recently, they worked with New Amsterdam to consult on a story that involved a character with Down syndrome. So we really try to come at it from all angles and really be a resource for them in staffing and, just to bring them more insight into the space.
That's great. Now I'd really like to bring everybody into the discussion. And this is really for whoever wants to answer first. Are most showrunners realizing the value of having diversity? I know it's natural to want to have your friends in the writer's room. Are showrunners starting to reach out beyond their own group of friends to seek out diversity?
Well, before we dive into it, I think one of the bigger hurdles that at least I've experienced in people that are at lower levels as writers have experienced is that when you're talking about inclusion and diversity, disability is last on the list, if it's on the list at all. So showrunners, agents, everyone being informed that that is another aspect of inclusion is something that's really important. And in terms of disclosure, there is a large portion of people with disabilities who have the privilege, luxury, whatever you want to call it, of not identifying from the beginning as someone who has a disability. And I have been told by former agents of mine that it's great that I'm a woman, great about the LGBTQ thing, but maybe just, don't tell them about the disability because they might doubt your ability to do the job. And it's only until I've become a supervising producer, co-EP, that level, where I have a track record of how hard I am able to work and that I feel comfortable enough identifying as that. And now I look back at that and feel like, oh, I owe it to a lot of other people who don't feel they're in that position to identify as that, and identify that as it publicly, as quickly and as broadly as possible.
Do any of our network executives have a comment on that? Are you trying to send the message to everyone to agents that we want, that disability is part of what we're looking for when we think about diversity and about inclusion?
I would agree with Elisabeth as far as reps go. I've sat in several staffing meetings for several years, and when agents pitch the writers, the non-diverse writers, they'll go off on their structure and dialogue and personal experience. But when it comes to a diverse writer of any kind of background, it's always like, oh, they're diverse and that's it. And then they move on to the next one. So I think part of the problem is the reps, the agents, and the managers who are sort of the gatekeepers. They are the ones who are dictating not only who is pitching and going to develop with networks, but also pitching writers for the writers' rooms. And if they're not pitching a multitude of different writers with various backgrounds, then obviously that's going to limit what the hiring executives and showrunners are seeing. So I think that is definitely a huge issue as well.
Yeah, just to piggyback on what Grace is saying, it's basically, I think what we're talking about is that there's a network of things that of organizations that are part of the television making and staffing process that really have to work together hand in hand in order to, open the process up to people of all sorts of diverse backgrounds, whether that's people with disabilities, people of different ethnic and racial backgrounds, etc. And I do think when we're talking about the reps, in having those staffing conversations, we have to just remember that it's not just about checking boxes, that not only is diversity inclusion the right thing to do, it ultimately does go back to what I was talking about earlier, creating better content, creating better, more authentic storytelling. So, and at the end of the day, I'm personally not a showrunner, but I would imagine that as a showrunner, you want people in the room that can give you great ideas. You're trying to make a great television show. So you want those people who are not like you to bring in that different perspective and to give you those stories that can ultimately elevate the quality of your show. So I think it's everybody working together to really say this is important and recognize the value of it.
And just, I want to add to, like, yes to all of that. And I know Disney is very proud to be working and with RespectAbility so closely. We recently were a proud sponsor and participated in the RespectAbility Lab that happened over the summer that helps with that with the pipeline of talent behind the screen. And you know, I think we want to be leaders in this space, and we really, like Jennifer is saying, there's so much intersectionality and grace, and Elisabeth, how disability is often not thought of when we think about diversity and inclusion, but disability also intersects every dimension of diversity. And so I think, and there are the community within, there's so many stories, and everyone's always looking for unique, you know, really captivating, great stories to tell to their audiences. And to me, it's like the possibilities are endless, and there's just so much opportunity there.
Yeah, I have one more thought, which is I definitely have felt showrunners that I've worked for, and I've had some wonderful showrunners. I've been fortunate to work with some really great ones, is that there's definitely a push for diversity and for inclusion, and to get those voices into the room to help them tell the stories. But I also think the best way to get showrunners to represent people is to make showrunners out of people with disabilities and all kinds of diverse backgrounds. That's what we're seeing in a lot of, you know, where people are making progress. We're seeing a lot of showrunners we're seeing a lot of women. There weren't women showrunners. Now there are many. And now there's writers' rooms, you know, a lot of writers' rooms now filled with women because of that. I think showrunners tend to want to tell a story that they can relate to, that speaks to them, and that they and the studio and the network that have worked together to create this show are excited and are proud of, and that's personal to them, and that they think is relatable. And I think they tend to surround themselves with people like them so that they can tell their story. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's part of what we try to do. That's how you make a story authentic, by telling a story that's personal to you. And for sure, we should have diversity on every single show, and we should be representing everybody on every, because I would like to think nobody lives in a world where everyone's just like them. But I also think we need shows with people with disabilities at the helm, so that they can, because ultimately, as much as you get to influence your showrunner making these creative decisions, ultimately it's their show and their decision. And I happen to have a showrunner who's very open to telling stories when he senses a writer's very passionate about it and it's very personal. But wouldn't it be nice?
So David, you're about, you know, if your series, the show that you are creating now, that's in the development pipeline, if that goes forward, you're going to be the showrunner of it, and you're going to have an opportunity to staff that room, correct?
Potentially. I'm still in the development phase, so I don't want to jinx it by saying a show. There's a lot of shows trying to go forward right now. But in the world where the show does go forward and I get to make staffing choices, absolutely. Because part of it is I'm going to want a lot of diverse people in the room, because one thing having a disability has taught me, especially what you talked about, acquired disability versus being born with a disability. I went from being a Caucasian, white, privileged male to being someone with a disability that all of a sudden had incredible new perspective and understanding and relationships with other people who had been excluded in a way that I didn't understand or even ever think about. So I'm going to want a room filled with people who understand what that feels like. So I'm going to want an incredibly diverse room, And I'm going to want a lot of people with disabilities in my room, all kinds of disabilities, not just wheelchair users like myself, but people with invisible disabilities, people with dyslexia, people with ASD, people who have hearing impairment, all kinds of people. So yeah, I think that will be a natural consequence of having a show on the air run by somebody who that's the story they want to tell.
Shoshannah, you know, you started as an actress and you're such a good writer. Are you going to be looking at potentially writing on other people's shows, or are you just going to continue to just write material for yourself?
I think my goal really is, out of everything I do, is to never do the same thing over and over again. I always want to stretch myself to do something different. So definitely, like if it's the right show, if the right show came along and they wanted me to be in the writer's room, I would definitely look into that, absolutely. But I think my focus currently is that I want to create opportunities. Like I want to create a space at the table where people can sit at. So by doing something like that, I think that really would be really focused on creating shows for myself and for other people.
And did you, oh, Elisabeth, yes.
I was just going to say, we had Shoshannah on Grey's Anatomy, and to David's point about diversity of the actual people with disabilities, she was not on our staff, but Shoshannah, you were a remarkable resource there too to help us, and we got to actually put on TV people who are wearing masks there it's clear, so they can actually lip read, so that we can include people in that, because there are a lot of people who are thinking, oh, I'd like to be a doctor, but this limits me. So having images of people, and the only time that her disability was brought up was when she chose to do it, and did it in a way to try and convince a character of getting on board with the medical thing, and she was making up half of it anyway. But it was her agency. She had the agency to do it, and the storyline was not about a deaf person comes to Grey's Anatomy. It was about this brilliant doctor comes, and these are the ways that we can change the way that medicine looks at it, so that we can everyone can do their jobs. So she is not only a writer, she came as an actress, but also as an amazing resource that we could talk to figure out how we could best represent it in medicine.
Can networks?
May I just jump in?
Oh, sure.
If I just could add to what Elisabeth mentioned, working on Grey's was such a model for, you know, how things could work and should work when you bring on a character with a disability. I was empowered in such miraculous ways, primarily by the showrunner, Renaud. Like, I feel like she saw me as a collaborator, like Elisabeth mentioned. I'm sorry, I'm freezing a little bit, but I was super empowered. Like, I think sometimes when I've worked on other shows, showrunners feel like I think showrunners feel like if they empower somebody else, they become weaker, they put themselves in a weaker position. But in reality, empowerment makes the show stronger. And so Grey's really modeled that in such a real way. And I really hope to see that on other shows, that other writers will use that same kind of model to use actors that have the minority experience to be able to be a resource.
You know, we really saw how when Disney and through ABC said, you know, we're going to have diversity as far as the actors in our shows. And I think, you know, Disney and then NBC, you know, were really out front. And it felt like the networks basically said, this is what we want. So it almost felt like you were saying, don't bring us shows where it's going to be all a bunch of white people. And it worked. It felt like change was mandated from the top. Can change be mandated from the top in this case with more representation of people with disability, their stories, you know, the show about a lawyer who happens to have a disability. It's not the point of his character. Disability also behind the scenes in terms of maybe a director who's deaf, or, you know, a director who's in a wheelchair.
I think that it definitely helps. Like, it's very important for it to come from the top, but I think it's also important to have champions at every level of a production. And so that everyone who's reviewing reviewing shows, I'm in standards and practices, when we're reviewing content, we might see, oh, maybe they're gonna add a character who has a disability, and it's an animated show, for instance. Then we have an opportunity to say, okay, well, who are you? Can you voice that character as somebody with a disability that has the same disability even, for us? And I think that there are so many ways throughout the process when shows are getting staffed. I think it's a matter of everybody keeping it top of mind, so that everyone is being a champion, because I think that just coming from the top, that's definitely, like I said, very helpful, but it doesn't have the same impact unless we're creating champions across the whole process.
Yeah, I would agree with Carolyn. I think for us, one mandate that we currently do have is with our Female Forward Directors program, which really did impact the landscape of female directors in television. And this is a program that is currently going into its third year, but through this program, directors are selected. They shadow on 2 or 3 episodes in the season, and they're guaranteed to direct an episode in that same season. And the first year of the program, 90% of the directors were invited back for additional episodes, whether it was on NBC or a different network. So I do think in that case, a mandate is slowly moving the dial. I think the ultimate goal would be to actually really shape the hearts and minds of the decision makers, where they don't need to have that mandate to hire sort of people from underrepresented communities, or to buy and develop shows from, you know, these diverse writers. That is the long-term goal, and I think for us, we are working to get there. But I do think mandates at some point are effective, at least with our directors programs.
I just wanted to piggyback on what Grace and actually Carolyn are saying. Mandates can be effective, but ultimately I think it's an education process. You really want people across the organization sort of having this concept diffused throughout the organization, so everybody understands that and believes in inclusion, and is thinking about it as they are creating the creative. So it's not something that is a mandate from the top. And then once again, because I think sometimes you can get into checking boxes that way, but it's really more about, we fundamentally understand that this is important. And so I think it's exposure and education with our showrunners. To David's point, just going back to what he was saying, you know, yes, having your showrunner is effectively the CEO of your show and of your company, which is your television show. And so the vision and everything comes from them. So having a showrunner who has a disability, or having a showrunner who is diverse, they will be more naturally inclined to then staff their shows accordingly. So that's why it's very important to have these diverse writers programs and these pipelines to start to create that the next generation of showrunners, so that in addition to mandates, you also are creating sort of the ecosystem in which diversity and inclusion is a natural part of the world in which we're creating.
Great, we've started to get some questions from the people watching. Talia wants to know what advice you'd have for someone like her with a visible physical disability who's trying to get an entry-level position in production crew side of things. Does she disclose it up front on the application and say what accommodations she might need? What's the best approach?
I mean, I'll jump in on that. I tend to not disclose my wheelchair use when I'm applying for a job. I kind of just show up, and although I've always got to call ahead to see if I can actually get into the building. But I tend to just show up and just start talking about what really matters, which is like what I'm going to do. So I actually like that question a lot, because I'd like to see, again, if I'm lucky enough to have a show go on the air, I'd like to see diversity in the crew too. And I've seen this question before on other panels I've been on over the years about people on the crew side of things saying, I want to spot too. And there's a ton of stigma and assumptions made about whether somebody, particularly with a physical or visible disability, can work on a film crew. And the fact of the matter is, it's a very easy thing to make a film set universally accessible. It's a huge open space. And not only is that, it's a big empty wheelchair accessible box that we create obstacles on when we build sets. Just like the whole world is a big open, potentially wheelchair and mobility accessible box that we create barriers to. We make barriers. They don't exist. We make a house and we put stairs to get into it when we don't need to. So that's part of a bigger discussion, I think, about the world in general and how we set things up. But I think it's true of the crew question. If we create sets that are wheelchair accessible, and I'm only speaking from wheelchair because I'm a wheelchair user, and that's been my experience being on sets. And that's true of every limitation that's been erected to prevent people from being able to do these jobs. If we create sets that allow people access, then it becomes irrelevant. And that's absolutely possible to do.
Great. Amy is a fan of great. Oh, I'm sorry, Shoshannah. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. If I could just piggyback and add to what David was mentioning, I think it's so important to have disabled people who work behind the camera as well, because they have a hidden value in that accommodation. Everybody benefits from them. Like from the ramps make it easier to bring the camera, for example, onto the set. Having open caption or closed caption makes it so easy to watch the playback with the sound off. Like with this close, we were able to hire 25 people who worked in front of and behind the camera. One second. So we actually wrapped early. I mean, not super early, but like really close to being on time. And everybody said that never happens. And it's because members of our crew said, we had to learn basic sign language to communicate with the other deaf members of the crew so they could communicate while we were shooting. So we can make adjustments that didn't have to be made after we stopped. So it made the filming process much easier. So I think like just getting into the room and then selling yourself, don't give them a reason to like put a barrier up for you. Just get into the room and sell yourself.
Great. Amy is a fan of Grey's Anatomy and Shonda Rhimes' other shows, but she notices so often that characters use the word lame as a slur. As someone who is a wheelchair cane user, I'd love to hear non-ableist slurs used to express something as uncool or off-putting. Is there a lot of conversation in the writer's room about, because we're all there. I mean, we've all done it. We've all used these words that we've grown up with. And then at the network level, obviously in the studio level, you're looking at those scripts. So is there, yet at the same time, you want your script to feel very real. So what's happening in terms of language usage?
Well, I can tell you in terms of Grey's. First of all, thank you for pointing that out, because I think that as much education as you can gain from people who are living that experience, the better, and the better we can do. So thank you for commenting and asking that question or making that comment. We, for the most part, if a community is being represented on screen on Grey's that isn't represented in the room, we bring in as many resources as possible. We spend a lot of time in the beginning of the season bringing in members from Color of Change, from ACLU, from LGBTQ communities, from both people with lived experience and from organizations about where the language shift should be, what the language shifts are, what's the evolution of it, and why, and the why behind it, which to me is the most important. And things are constantly evolving and changing, and people make mistakes. And I think what's important is watching people make mistakes and hear and listen to people who are telling them why it shouldn't be that way, and adjusting accordingly, and not be so defensive about, well, yeah, well, we try all these other ways and we get all these other things right. Like, okay, cool, we got some other things right. We got these things wrong. Let's look at it. Let's change it. Let's do some more research. Let's bring some more people in. Let's do better. Certainly with the way that the world has evolved in terms of COVID and Black Lives Matter, and that revolution, bringing in more people and how we can have discussions and watch our white characters fumble. And so we can mirror what it is to fumble and to course correct and to be educated and to learn and to show that you're not perfect and you're trying. I'll take perfect and imperfect and trying any day in any community for anyone.
That's great. We have about 4 more minutes, and I'm wondering if anyone else on the panel wants to have a few final thoughts.
I would love to share that I think it's so wonderful to be a part of this panel and to see how much more representation of people with disabilities in entertainment media is just like is becoming more normal part of the conversation. My son has several multiple food allergies, and it wasn't until he's 7 now, and when he was 4, there was a Daniel Tiger episode where Daniel Tiger learns he has an allergy to peaches, and my son's face lit up like I had never seen before, because he never, even though we were told by doctors, oh, you'll meet lots of kids who have food allergies, we actually never met anyone who did. And it was like this, it was so amazing to see the positive impact that representation can have. And even though Daniel Tiger has a different food allergy than what my son has, just that camaraderie and seeing himself on the screen is just, that's what it's all about, is so that kids and adults can see themselves reflected on the screen and know that it can be a lonely experience. Having food allergies, for instance, and having to sit separately from kids at birthday parties and worrying what's going to touch them or not. And I think there's just so much power in kids content in particular, where kids can see themselves, who don't have that experience can learn how to relate when they meet someone that has that experience, and also for parents to see their kids, to see that kids can have that they can have a life, and that what that looks like. And I think it's so much, the impact that media can have really is so large on what we can do for stigma around disability in general outside of the screens as well.
Oh, that's great, Carolyn. Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else?
Yeah, I would add to that, and I think that's all great, is when I first had my accident, I mean, nobody was talking about disability as diversity or about inclusion, as someone that it didn't even feel like there was an organized, cohesive community where everyone got together. And certainly when I moved to LA, nobody was saying, we need more disability representation in film and television. I mean, you were either the butt of a joke, or you were an inspirational story, or a quick way to make someone feel sorry for a character. So the fact that we're talking about this, and as I said, I've been on a couple of panels. I've been lucky enough to be invited to a few of these panels over the last couple of years now. And I think the fact that we're all talking about this and these panels are happening, and I'm also, I don't want to be the only wheelchair user around to be on these panels. There are others now, and there are other people with disabilities, and we have somebody with ASD in our writer's room. So there are other people out there. The more people we get in the rooms, the more people have these discussions. It's just a wonderful thing to be a part of this panel and to see that these kind of discussions are happening.
Well, great. Well, we are out of time. David, Shoshannah, Elisabeth, Carolyn, Grace, Jennifer, thank you so much for sharing this. I learned a lot, so I'm sure the people watching this and the chat room is just going crazy. So I think you've sparked something. So thank you very much for your participation. You're all doing great work.
Thank you. It's our pleasure.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.